We're taking a look at James. I'm jumping to chapter 5. And this section, starting in verse 13, is about prayer, but not just about prayer. It's about effective prayer. Because a lot of people pray. Um, he's talking specifically about prayer that gets results. And you've heard me say before, prayer is the power that moves the hand of God. I think that was Andrew Murray who originally said that. But regardless of who said it, it's true that you read in Daniel chapter 9 that Gabriel only appeared to him after he had begun praying. Gabriel said, as soon as you began praying, I was dispatched. And so it's really a very interesting thought, more than interesting, very powerful thought, that until we pray, nothing happens. And so here we read in verse 13, chapter 5, book of James. Okay, remember, this is being written to Jews who would have been very, very familiar with what we would call the Old Testament. And at that point, when James was written, probably the first letter, when he said the Bible, they only thought of the Old Testament because that's all they had. The epistles hadn't been written yet. James writes what we believe was the first one, written in 49 AD. And so he says this, is anyone among you in trouble? Let them pray. Is anyone happy? Let them sing songs of praise. Is anyone among you sick? Let them call the elders of the church to pray over them and anoint them with oil in the name of the Lord. Note, call the elders to pray over them. Now, the anointing is interesting, and some think it's the oil that somehow saves. It's not. It's the prayer. But they are selecting that person for the prayer, and they are identifying him before God with the oil. And the prayer offered in faith. Okay, so it's not just praying. It's not empty praying. It's not just saying the words. It's not repeating an incantation. It's faith that's expressed in prayer. And the prayer offered in faith will make the sick person well. The Lord will raise them up. If they have sinned, they will be forgiven. Now, the sins that they have confessed. Therefore, confess your sins to each other. So it makes clear. It assumes they confess their sin and pray for each other so that they may be healed. Okay, so here he's talking about the fact that some sickness is a direct result of sin in our lives. The I know that that's a very interesting topic. I'm not going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about prayer because prayer is what is powerful. Prayer is what results in change that otherwise we will not see. And so he says the prayer of a righteous person is powerful and effective. So he puts a condition on the answering of prayer. And he's talking here about someone who is righteous, righteous before God. And now he uses the example Elijah. Elijah was a human being. Now, Elijah's name means my Lord is God, or El is God. Elohim is God. God is Jehovah. There's a variety of different ways of translating it, but it all means I'm not worshiping Baal. I am worshiping the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he says Elijah was a human being. So, in other words, nothing special about him. He was a human being just like us, even as we are. And then it says he prayed earnestly that it would not rain. And it didn't rain on the land for 3.5 years. And then again he prayed, and the heavens gave rain, and the earth produced its crops. Now, the story of Elijah is a pretty powerful one. I mean, to stop the rain, that's an incredible thing. But for 3 years, let's go back now and take a look at 1 Kings 17. Okay, and here is where we read about Elijah and this extraordinary prayer. Now, Elijah the Tishbite from Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab, now Ahab was the king, and Ahab was an evil king. As a matter of fact, if we go back a little bit, we're going to see that in the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah, Ahab, who was the son of Omri, became king of Israel. Okay, so this is the northern kingdom. And he reigned in Samaria, which was another word used for much of that portion of Israel. He reigned in Samaria over Israel for 22 years. And then it says that he did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. Okay, so he was bad. He was really bad. And it says he not only considered it trivial to commit the sins of Jeroboam, sin of Nebat, but he also married Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and began to serve Baal and worship him. Okay, so not only did he sin against Jehovah, but he began to worship Baal. Now notice the name of Jezebel's father, Ethbaal, and he was king of the Sidonians. Now, Sidon was in the north, just north of Tyre, so on the coast of the Mediterranean. Now, it's important to know that because the rest of the story, there's something that happens in Sidon that you may not have recognized before. If you know the story, you may not have recognized it. But Jezebel was the daughter of a king who his name linked him to Baal. Elijah's name linked him to God. And so Jezebel was bad. I mean, and you know a bit about her, but she was she was evil and corrupted Ahab even more. And so uh, Ahab then begins to worship Baal. And so he sets up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal that he built in Samaria. And then he also made an Asherah pole and did more to arouse the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, than did all the kings of Israel before him. Okay, so God is quite upset with Ahab. And then we see that in Ahab's time, Hiel of Bethel rebuilt Jericho. Now, Jericho, you may recall, when Joshua tore it down, he had a prophecy about Jericho. So let's take a look at this prophecy. So we'll go back to the book of Joshua, chapter 6, and verse 26. And what we see is that Joshua pronounced a curse, a solemn oath on whoever would attempt to rebuild Jericho. Cursed before the Lord is the one who undertakes to rebuild this city, Jericho. And he tells the verse, that's what it is right here. At the cost of his firstborn son, he will lay its foundations. At the cost of his youngest, he will set up its gates. Okay, so that's the curse. So let's see what happens. Ahab now is there. Hiel of Bethel rebuilt Jericho at Ahab's command. And what we see is that he laid its foundations at the cost of his firstborn son, Abiram, exactly what Joshua said would happen. And he set up its gates at the cost of his youngest son, Segub, in accordance with the word of the Lord spoken by Joshua, son of Nun. Now, archaeologists have discovered that it was the practice in those days that they would often bury a child under the foundations of a city. In other words, they were dedicating a child as a child sacrifice to Baal and placing him under the foundations of the city gates so that the god that they were worshiping, in this case Baal, would bless that city. Okay, and so it fulfills the prophecy of Joshua. Okay, so that's the background. You've got this incredibly evil king who marries an even more evil wife, and he does evil things, all in the name of Baal. Okay, so now we have Elijah. Elijah, who is named after God. It's like wearing a sweatshirt all the time that just says, God, Jehovah is my God everywhere that he goes because that's his name. And so he says to Ahab, As the Lord, that is Jehovah. See, it's all caps. And when in the English we have it translated, it's all caps, it's translating Jehovah. If it's just the first letter that's capitalized, remember the translation then is of Adonai, which is just a generic word for master or Lord. So, as the Lord, as Jehovah, the God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word. And so now the word of the Lord comes to Elijah. And he says, leave here, turn eastward, and hide in the ravine east of the Jordan. You will drink from the brook, and I have directed the ravens to supply you with food there. And so what we find out when Jesus speaks, okay, back in Luke 4:24, is the location. He says, truly I tell you, this is Jesus and Luke speaking, no prophet is accepted in his own hometown. Okay, certainly Elijah was not. And that's the illustration. I assure you that there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's time when the sky was shut for 3.5 years and there was a severe famine throughout the land. Yet Elijah was not sent to any of them, but to a widow in Zarephath. And so where was Zarephath? Zarephath was in the region of Sidon. Who was the king of Sidon? Ethbaal, Jezebel's father. So that was the place of the enemy. Okay, so um, he says, leave here, turn eastward, hide at Kerith east of the Jordan. You will drink from the brook, and I've directed the ravens to supply you with food there. So he did what the Lord had said. He went to the Kerith ravine, east of the Jordan, stayed there, and the ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. Okay, so now he's not in Sidon yet. So now he's gone to the east, and he's being fed by the ravens. Now, remember, ravens were essentially, well, they're like crows, very similar to crows, slight difference, but basically in that family. And they were unclean. So Elijah had to accept the fact that God was directing him to eat, being fed by an unclean creation of God. And you see here in the Old Testament, one of the hints that uncleanness was not sin. It was given to preserve so that they would avoid sin. And the ravens come and they feed him every day. And they brought him bread and meat in the morning and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. So now he's drinking from the brook. Now, remember, he stopped the rain. Well, what happens when there's no rain for an extended period of time? In this case, it was 3.5 years. Well, at some point, the brook dries up. So, as a direct result of his prayer, the brook dries up. Sometime later, the brook dried up because there had been no rain in the land. So, this is a direct result of what he did. He could have, at that point, um, said, this is horrible. Okay, he had this command go to the uh, Kerith or the Cherith River, which means cut off. It's a place in the wilderness. Um, and by the way, in the wilderness, there's no food. Okay, so God sends him to a place where, by definition, there's no food. And he's going to be fed by the birds. Somebody could say, yeah, right. Okay, you're going to feed me with the birds. Well, the birds fed him. So it's the sense in which this is, in essence, equivalent to the Israelites being fed from manna. And you recall that they got up in the morning, that first morning there, and they looked out on the ground. There was this white stuff. They didn't know what it was. And they said in Hebrew, manna, which means, what is it? And for 40 years, that's what they ate. God provided every day. Well, 6 days a week. On Friday, he provided a double portion because on the Sabbath, they were not to pick it up. So they had enough on Friday for both days. God provided, and he provided in the wilderness. And so if they looked at it humanly, rationally, they would have said, why are we going into the wilderness? There's nothing to eat there. And Elijah could have said same thing. You're sending me to the wilderness to eat there. And I believe God makes things happen in that way because faith always assumes the lack of something so that you have to trust God. And in the wilderness, there was nothing. We go into our own wilderness times. We encounter situations where we see no way out of the predicament that we're in, whatever it happens to be, whether it's with health, whether it's with money, whether it's with provisions, whether it's with housing or whatever. We see no way out, but God can provide. I remember when I was pastoring, Ingrid and I were there, and we were living in the parsonage. And as we considered things, we realized that we really needed to buy a house. We believed God was directing us to buy a house. There was only one little problem. We didn't have any down payment. Well, we started looking for housing, and we went out with a realtor, a woman in the church, who took us around, but nobody else knew that we were looking for any housing. And the one Sunday, a woman walked up after church with her friend. Now, the woman was a regular attender, wonderful, delightful, committed Christian woman, a widow. And she brought with her a friend of hers who had never been in the church before. And the friend handed me an envelope. And the envelope was a check for $10,000. And she just said, Jesus wants you to have this. Well, that in those days was a down payment for a house. And that got us back into the housing market. We never would have been able to buy a house again if we hadn't had that happen. And I never found out why she felt led to give us the $10,000, but she was absolutely definite, that the Lord wanted us to have it. And so you can be in the wilderness where you see no possible solution to the problems that you're in. And yet God is able to provide in the most amazing ways. With Elijah, he sends ravens into the wilderness to feed him. And Elijah's response when God said, I'm going to send ravens to feed you, and you're going to go into the wilderness, and in the midst of no rain, there's going to be a brook and you'll have water and you'll have food and you'll have a meal in the morning and you'll have a meal in the night. You'll have bread and meat in the morning, bread and meat at night. And he did. And what did he do what was his response? It just says he went and did in verse 5. Okay, so now you see the result in verse 6. He's getting food every single day. And they did this day after day after day. Notice they didn't bring him a truck full of food. He didn't come on a cave full of food. Rather, it was every day. He had to trust every single day. Think of the Lord's Prayer. We pray for our daily bread. That's it. That's what we need. We need enough to make it through the day. Jesus has a lot to say about just making it through today. Life is lived daily. He says, sufficient for the day are the evils thereof. Don't worry about problems for tomorrow. Yeah, obviously, you need to plan for the future, but ultimately, you trust God for today and you make it through today. And you string together enough todays, and that's a week, and more weeks, that's a month, and more months, that's a year. And you make it through the most difficult times in life by doing it a day at a time. Um, and so the ravens fed him, even though the fault that he had there, the problem was he was running out of water, and he ran out of water because of his own prayer. Okay, and so, you could look at that, and certainly it's human to look at that and say, Lord, I just ran out of water. You led me here into the wilderness so that I'm going to die of thirst, and you can feel sorry for yourself. Or you could complain, say, this is unfair. I obeyed, and God sends trouble. Or you might just get angry and get frustrated. I knew something would go wrong. Something always goes wrong. But the dried up brook was the direct result of his prayer, and God sent it. And God sent it so that he would go somewhere else. God works all things together for good. to those who are called according to his purpose. Every dried up brook comes from God in the believer's life, and it's giving us direction. And Elijah's response was he believed this next command that God gave him. So then the word of the Lord came to him and said, go at once to Zarephath in the region of Sidon and stay there. Okay, so now here's what he should say. Remember Ethbaal, the king of Sidon? Jezebel, that's her home. He's going into enemy territory. This is not even in Israel. This is not Samaria. He leaves the country to the far north on the coast, goes to Sidon, which is even north of Tyre, and he goes to this village that is an alien village, an enemy village, and he's going to a widow. Now, what do you know about widows from studying the scriptures? You know, a widow was impoverished. It was the widow who brought two mites. That was all the money she had. That was virtually nothing. That a widow, who was a true widow, like Ruth, wound up having to glean. They didn't have spare food. And here we're in a situation where there's a famine. And so God says, I've directed a widow there to supply you with food. Now, Elijah, if he were a skeptic, could say, yeah, right. Okay, a widow. Send me to a palace. Send me to somebody who's wealthy, someone who's got a storehouse. You're sending me to a widow? Uh, what does he do? He goes to Zarephath. And when he came to the town gate, a widow was there gathering sticks. Now, the fact that she was gathering sticks meant she didn't even have money for wood. Okay, so she was poor. And he called to her and he asked, would you bring me a little water in a jar so I may have a drink? And as she was going to get it, he called, and bring me, please, a piece of bread. Okay. So now this is a real demand, particularly when you find out about the state of this woman. She answers and she says, as surely as the Lord your God lives. Notice she doesn't say the Lord God. She knows he's his God. I don't have any bread. I only have a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I'm gathering a few sticks to take home so that I can make a small fire, so that I can make a meal for myself and my son. And then what's next? That we may eat it. This is our last meal. This is all we have left and die. Okay. Boy, did he pick the wrong widow. Boy, did he pick the wrong place to go. But this is where God sent him. Okay, so this is like the wilderness. The wilderness and the dried up brook were only a test. Now he's going to an even more impossible situation. You know, in the wilderness, he could have known, and certainly did. He knew the story of the manna and that God had preserved the people for 40 years in the wilderness. Now he's going to a woman who has nothing. And he's asked her for water. Maybe she can find water, but bread, she has absolutely nothing. And so Elijah says to her, don't be afraid. Interesting. She was afraid. She was afraid of him. Perhaps she recognized he was a prophet. She was afraid of him. And so he says, go home and do as you have said. But first make us, so in other words, go home and make some bread for your son and yourself, and drink, and from the little water that you have in the jar. But first make something for me. So that was interesting. He's basically saying, as a test of your faith, okay, make something for me first. And she does it. And he says, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, he doesn't say my God, he says the God of Israel says, the jar of flour will not be used up, the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land. And she believes him. That's an act of faith. And so she goes away and she does as Elijah had told her. So there was food every day for Elijah and for the woman and her family. For the jar of flour was not used up, and the jug of oil did not run dry, in keeping with the word of the Lord spoken by Elijah. Notice he didn't give her a massive jar. He didn't give her a huge amount of oil. He provided for her every day. She made it through the day, day by day, as did Elijah. So the command to Elijah was go to Zarephath and stay, go into enemy territory in the land of Ethbaal, in the land of Jezebel. Okay, and a blessing was promised. A widow will take care of you. I mean, that really is a crazy blessing. Okay, a really, really, really impoverished person is going to provide for you. And Elijah's response throughout was he went, he arose and went. And so he found this widow who was near death with two sticks, no flour. The wheat was dead, no olive, no oil. The olive trees had dried up. And what he could have done, as many do, is feel sorry for himself. But his concern turned to keeping the woman alive. And we read about that in Luke 4. And so he spoke God's impossible command to the widow. He said, go bake bread for me before you make some for you and your son. And she believed it. And in that, there was the blessing that she'd be able to make it for her son and herself. But beyond that, the blessing that the grain and oil would not be exhausted. And she obviously believed it because in verse 15, we read, she went and did as Elijah had told her. Okay, so here is a woman. It's kind of like the Syrophoenician woman, or there were others that we read about in the New Testament in Jesus' day who were not Jews, who believed in some cases impossible commands. They believed and they trusted. So the command was go bake bread. And she could have said, oh, come on, you're kidding me. I can't do it. And there's a promised blessing. And the blessing happens. And she does it. And so the result is she and her household ate flour and oil, had bread, and it was not exhausted. She ate. It's incredible. When you start looking at this story, you realize that um, this was quite a prayer. And this was quite a response. And the two of them were people of incredible faith. Dried Up Brook was a test. It was a test that prepared him for the widow. And the situation with the widow, to be fed by a widow, was more of the test that prepared him for the time when he would go back before um, before Ahab and uh, really show that God was far more powerful than Baal. So it was all preparation. So we read, so there was food every day for Elijah and for the woman and her family. So every day, provision from God's hands proved daily God answers prayer. You can trust God. This was a training time for the woman, for her son, and for Elijah. But there was more. It says, for the jar of flour was not used up, the jug of oil did not run dry, in keeping with the word of the Lord spoken by Elijah, until the rain started. Once the rain started, then at that point, they didn't need it any longer. And at that point, that particular blessing ended. But look at this. Sometime later, the son of the woman who owned the house became ill. He grew worse and worse and finally stopped breathing. And you can imagine she had said to Elijah multiple times, do something, do something, do something. He's going to die. He's going to die. He's going to die. And then she says to Elijah, what do you have against me, man of God? Did you come to remind me of my sin and kill my son? Okay, because Elijah had not saved her son. He died. God hadn't saved her son. He died. And then Elijah says, give me your son. And he took him from her arms, okay, which means the child was young, could have been just a few years old. Okay, now remember the length of the famine was 3.5 years. Now we find out this was a young widow. This wasn't an elderly widow. This was a young widow. Her husband had been taken from her perhaps a year or two earlier, perhaps not that long before Elijah had appeared. And so Elijah takes the child from his arms, carries him to the upper room where he was staying, and laid him on his bed. And then he cries out to the Lord. So now, earnest and fervent prayer. Lord my God, have you brought tragedy even on this widow I am staying with by causing her son to die? Do you see he talks to God? Just it's what you would expect. Be honest with God. Talk to God. And he says, look, you brought tragedy on this widow I'm staying with by causing her son to die. And then he stretched himself out on the boy 3 times, and he cried out to the Lord, Lord, my God, let this boy's life return to him. Okay, he obviously believes it. He didn't ask once, he asked 3 times, and he knows that God has the power, and he begs him to do it. It's earnest for certain, and it winds up being quite effective because the Lord hears Elijah's cry, and the boy's life returned to him, and he lived. Now, that is a big prayer. That is a massive prayer. But he prepared for that prayer by having the brook dried up, being fed by the ravens. And when the brook dried up, he no longer needed the ravens, and he goes to a widow, and a widow who is impoverished, deeply impoverished. Um, he sees the miracle that he told her she would have, and God answered his prayer, and she experienced that miracle with him, and her son experienced it. You can imagine the training that was in faith for her son as well as for the woman. And then the boy dies, and he prays, and the boy is restored to life. Well, Elijah picked up the child, carried him down from his room into the house. Okay. So he's carrying him down the steps. So it's obviously a young child. He gave him to his mother and said, look, your son is alive. You can imagine how overjoyed she was, how grateful she was. And now she knew that God was the one who had all the power. Now I know that you are a man of God and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth. Okay, now remember, she was in a country where people believed that Baal was the one who spoke the truth. And here was this man who worshiped this other God. And initially she called him your God. But now obviously she understood that Jehovah, the Lord, was the God and spoke the truth. Let's go back now to James. Elijah was a human being. The prayer of a righteous person is powerful and effective. And the point is, he's no different than us. And the point James is making is God will answer your prayer. If you say you trust in God, and then you go and you just do things on your own. You're going to pray, but now I'm going to fulfill this prayer on my own the best I can, even though I don't really have the ability. You're basically saying God can't. It's kind of like asking someone to do something for you. Maybe you've delegated to someone else, and then you go ahead and you do it yourself. Are you really trusting God in that situation? Are we trusting God? No, obviously not. So we have to learn the lesson of the dried up brook, and we have to, pray knowing that God will provide. So now we'll go a little bit farther. He was a human being like us. He prayed earnestly that it would not rain, and it didn't rain on the land for 3.5 years. That's a long time. And again he prayed, and the heavens gave rain, and the earth produced its crops. My brothers and sisters, if one of you should wander from the truth and someone should bring that person back, remember this. Whoever turns a sinner from the error of their way will save them from death and cover over a multitude of sins. I believe that in context, what he's talking about is when people see your prayers answered, just as it drew the widow to worship God, so too they see your faith and they will be drawn to the Lord. But if they never see it, who then will lead them to the Lord? Okay, so this is it's a great story, and of course, with him going up to the mountain and speaking to the prophets of Baal and telling them, I want you to gather a lot of wood and I want you to kill an oxen and I want you to wait there and call upon Baal to light the fire. Now, why would they call on Baal to light the fire? Well, they called on Baal to light the fire because Baal was the sky god. He brought lightning, they thought. He controlled the weather. Okay, and so the lack of rain was directly a charge against Baal, God demonstrating Baal had no power. And so there the prophets are on the top of the mountain, and they are begging Baal for half a day to somehow bring down fire from heaven, lightning, to set the sacrifice on fire. And nothing happened. And then Elijah comes, as you read in 1 Kings 18, and he says, okay, now I have wood and a sacrifice, and we're going to dig a trench around all of this. We're going to cover everything with water and more water and more water. We're going to soak it. There's going to be water all around in the trench. And once it's impossible for this to catch fire in any way, I'm going to call on God. And he does that and calls on God. The lightning strikes, it laps up the water, and it consumes the sacrifice. And then they knew that indeed the God Jehovah was God of the universe, not Baal. And then, of course, you recall how he went out and killed the prophets, how Obadiah went out and killed the prophets of Baal. Actually, Obadiah protected 100 prophets. You read about that in 1 Kings 18, 100 prophets of Jehovah. So anyway, I'm going to stop right there. But this is all about really, really praying, believing that God answers prayers. These are big, big, big prayers, impossible prayers, calling down lightning from heaven, impossible prayers, raising the dead, impossible prayers, um, eating in the wilderness where there's no food, impossible prayers, having a widow who's impoverished provide for you day after day after day, impossible prayers. This is quite an illustration that you find in James, but that's the illustration that God gives through James.